I think we're live. All right, everybody. I'll give a second for the chat to jump up here. But that was loud. All right. All right. Anybody who's supposed to be upstairs, go upstairs. Anybody supposed to be downstairs, go downstairs. Now's the time. I think all y'all who are here belong here, though. So, all right. Well, I, in my own infinite wisdom, I put the resurrection and Martin Luther on the same day. So we're just gonna kind of scrape right over the surface because there's a lot to cover here. But any of you who want to follow along in your Bibles today, we're looking at Luke 24. And we'll take a look at the resurrection. So one thing that we preachers are really terrible at is not spoiling the end. So yeah, we're in the season of Lent. We're headed to a great time. And spoiler alert, Jesus comes back from the dead. I said none of you seem shocked, so I guess you all knew that. But that's where we're heading. So that's what we're looking at here tonight. The reason that we wanted to look at this, I wanted to look at this as a part of the study, is because, let's be honest, this is it. I mean, this is the central theme of Christianity. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of other great stuff about being a Christian and all that, but this is it. This is the top of the line. So I wanted a chance to look at this with you. Now, what I want to ask you to do is going to be a little bit tough. I want us to, as best as we can, look at this passage as if we've never read it before. Okay? It's one you obviously all have heard every Easter and other times of the year, your entire lives, so it's not like anything shocking here. But I want to pretend like this first that we're reading the end of the story not knowing how it was going to end. So keep that in mind. Second thing I want you to keep in mind is we're going to look at this as it was originally intended, which means we're going to look at it as the Gospel of Luke. So in some of the other Gospels, some different things happen. We're not going to worry about that, okay? We're only going to look at this in the context of the way Luke told it to us. So we're not going to be. I don't want to take time to consider, because some of the details not really different, but some of the other gospel writers include things that Luke doesn't include, and Luke writes some stuff, and I don't want to get into any of that. We're just looking at Luke tonight, and because Luke, the way he presents the resurrection, I find to be utterly fascinating, and that's what I look forward to sharing it with you. So that's why I picked Luke's version, and looking forward to looking at that with you. So, with that disclaimer, any questions before we start? That's all good? All right, you guys have already got the blank stare. Awesome, we're only 2 minutes in. So this is Luke chapter 24, verse 1. Now, very early on Sunday morning, the women went to the tomb. All right, so remember, we Christians today think of our holy day as Sunday. And that's the way we've always done it. That was not the case in these days. The holy day was Saturday. So if you look at how, what Sabbath was and all that stuff, it was Saturday. So for them to say this is the first day of the week, it's a whole new concept. So it wasn't like Jesus came back on the holy day. It's kind of the other way around. It became the holy day because that's the day Jesus came back. So that's why we celebrate worship on Sunday in our times today. So very early on Sunday morning, the women went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. So they were going out there, obviously, with an intention to embalm. Remember, Jesus went from the cross to the grave very quickly because they were trying to get him in the grave before the sun went down. Why was that? Go ahead. Oh, that's John, not Luke. That's the Gospel of John. Mm-hmm. Yep, very good. But that's why we're staying with this one, because if we did all of them, we could do all of them. Nicodemus shows up in John. The reason they were in a hurry was because, why were they in a hurry to get him in before sundown? Passover. Sabbath, a very special Sabbath of the Passover. They wanted to get that done because they didn't want to compromise themselves for Passover. So he was very hastily put in the tomb. The stone was placed, And now the Passover, the Holy Day happened, which would have been Saturday. And now early on Sunday morning, the day after the Sabbath, they were going out to do what should have been done before. Yeah.
So why were they bringing spices?
That it was part of an embalming. See, they didn't have formaldehyde back in those days, so it was how they were embalmed.
But it says then put the stones in all the way.
Correct. That which is not what they expected to find when they got out there.
How are they going to get in there?
It's a good question. It's a good question. My thought is that the stone was either hastily put in place so they would kind of squeeze into the side, or they had some way to get access to it. Maybe there were workers in the cemetery that would help, because in one of the versions, here I said we weren't going to do this, and here we go. In one of the other versions, she runs into Jesus. She thinks he's the gardener, so there would have been men out there to help with that. So, yeah. But that's what they were going out to do. Now, so they're going out there, and then verse 2, they found out the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. Now, a very fascinating thing I found here. The phrase translated rolled away, here in the New Living Translation, is the word apocalypse. Now, did anybody know the word apocalypse? What is it? If anybody knows what it is, tell me what it is. Yes, suddenly happening, but even bigger than that. Yeah, talking. Yeah, very. Yes, very, very big. In fact, even bigger than that. Even apocalypse is what we would call a revealing, a dramatic revealing. Okay. Also, that's what the title of the book of Revelation is. It's the Apocalypse of John. That's what if you read the book of Revelation, I think we could argue some big stuff happens in that book. So that's the kind of thing we're using here. This is not the stone was tipped over, or the stone was. This is a dramatic thing. Now, whenever this happens, the implication is something's about to be revealed. Okay, so whenever in the Bible there's an apocalypse, somebody's about to learn something. Which is why, how Luke words this is very, very specific. Luke is choosing his words very carefully here. So it says, the stone to be rolled away, apocalypse had been revealed. So what was revealed? Verse 3. So they went in, but didn't find the body of the Lord. You see the dramatic irony here? There's nothing there. That's what was revealed. The grave where Jesus had been placed was empty. No one was there. So thinking it's going to be this dramatic moment, they walk in, nobody's there. They didn't find the body of the Lord. Verse 4, as they stood there puzzled, which again, puzzled makes it sound like they were like, what? No, that's not the word here. The word here is distraught, okay? Upset. As any of you would be. If you were going out to a cemetery and there was a hole where there should have been somebody buried, somebody's going to be upset. That's what these people are, okay? So it's not like they were like, well, shucks, what's going on? No, not that at all. Very, very dramatically upset. And then 2 men suddenly appeared to them, clothed in dazzling robes. So these women, who are now distraught, they're there, and suddenly they're not alone. There are 2 guys standing there. I find it utterly fascinating that nobody's curious where these guys came from. I mean, and to make it worse, the word here used dazzling. This isn't like they turn and they go, my, how did you get those robes so white? And they're like, we use Tide Pods. And no, that's not what we're talking about. This is a supernatural thing. Every time this word is used, somebody's talking to an angel whenever this word shows up. Okay, so this isn't like, cleanest robes I ever. No, it's not that. It's this is it's like radiant. I mean, it's just not anything that we would know. It's not a cotton polyester blend or anything like that. This is something really amazing. Verse 5, and the women were terrified. Another example of the Bible's. I mean, there ain't nothing like the Bible to understate things. So they go in. Supposed to find a dead body. They don't find that. Now 2 guys are there that weren't there before. So where did they come from? It's not like they came from inside the grave or anything. So they just appear. It says they're terrified. Again, I looked up that word terrified. It's a word that doesn't translate into English very well, so I'm assuming the translators had trouble with it. But again, it has a supernatural origin. So it wasn't like they were like, please don't kill us. It wasn't anything like that. It was awe and wonder of something magnificent that they were there. It's bigger than just, oh my goodness, where did you come from? Or oh, you startled me. It wasn't anything like that. This is the way you would respond if, you walk outside tonight and there's a dinosaur walking through the parking lot or something. I mean, it's that kind of shock. Okay? And they bow with their faces to the ground. Again, most people don't bow to the ground for just everyday things. This is a big deal. So for them to do that, they clearly understand. This is a response you give when you all of a sudden realize, wow, we're in the presence of God now. Okay? And that's what happens here. So the response shows that they at least had some kind of understanding. Whether they actually understood it or not, I'm not sure. But they were responding in such a way that they realized they were in the presence of God. So they bowed low with their faces to the ground. Then the men asked, "Why are you looking among the dead for someone who is alive? He isn't here. He is risen from the dead. Remember what he told you back in Galilee. The Son of Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and that he would rise again on the third day." Again, Jesus said this in the Gospel of Luke multiple times, and clearly people were not really understanding what was going to happen. So these two guys are whoever they are. Again, nobody seems curious as to who they are or where they came from. We don't know their names. They don't say, hey, I was with Daniel in Babylon, or I'm Gabriel, and whoever. But they just basically repeat what Jesus had told them multiple times in a lot of different scenarios. And so they tell him this, and then the women, verse 8, then they remembered he had said this. Oh, yeah, he did mention that. I remember him saying that. Okay, so, tomb open, shouldn't have been. Body gone, definitely shouldn't have been. People there who shouldn't have been there, dressed in clothes that we don't know what they looked like because they were amazing. And they said, remember, Jesus already told you this. And the women are like, yeah, he did. We may not have 100% understood that's what he meant, but we do remember him mentioning that. And so they remember that. And then verse 9, so they rushed back from the tomb to tell the 11 disciples and everyone else what had happened. Okay. So they go back to tell everybody, obviously. So they go back, and now, this is where things start to get interesting. Verse 10. At the end of the account of this event, Luke says, oh, by the way, here's who was there. Here are the people. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and several other women. Whoever, I don't know who they were. And they told the apostles what happened. Okay, I went back and did some checking. Who let the cricket in? First of all, Mary Magdalene. Anybody know who Mary Magdalene is? No, let me rephrase the question. Did anybody know who historically has been assigned to be Mary Magdalene? Who's that? Who is it? Okay, a lot of people want to say that she is Martha's sister, Mary. Martha, and if you go to Gospel of John, also Lazarus' sister. There's a little problem with that. The place where Mary and Martha show up in Luke is in Luke chapter 8. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Not 8. Luke chapter... Oh, nuts, did I not write that down? I think it's chapter 10. Anyways, it shows up, and in this version of the story, there's no Lazarus. Luke never mentions Lazarus, but he does mention Mary and Martha. And it's the story where Jesus is teaching in the living room, and the disciples are there, and Mary's sitting on the floor, and Martha's being, the host with the most, busy, and finally Martha goes, Jesus, will you tell Mary to help me? Y'all know that story? Some of you do, some of you don't. It's a story that happens if you're willing to trust me. So, and that's the story. Now, Jesus gets there in that account. It says, Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, and they happened to pass by Mary and Martha's house, so they stopped because they were friends. Okay, makes sense. Here's the problem. This is why Mary Magdalene and Mary, the sister of Martha, doesn't work. Mary Magdalene, that phrase means Mary from Magdala, which was a town. We happen to know where that is. Would you like to know how far Magdala is from Jerusalem? 113 miles. And Jesus was walking on foot. So, if you were going to walk 113 miles, would you say, oh, we were passing by your house on the way to Jerusalem? And be like, hey, I was just passing your house on my way to, what? Like, not even Columbus. I'm not even sure what city is 113 miles from here. No. So that's why I'm telling you, this is not Mary, sister of Martha, sister of Lazarus. Not the same Mary. It's a different person. Mary Magdalene shows up one other time in the Gospels. She shows up in Luke chapter 8. In Luke chapter 8, Jesus was going through and healing some people in this town, and just by passing reference, happens to mention, oh, and Mary Magdalene was there, and he cast a couple demons out of her. End of story. I mean, that's literally the whole story. The only time she shows up. That's Luke chapter 8, verse 2. In Luke chapter 8, verse 3, there's another woman there whose name is Joanna. If you will look, Joanna is also here. Joanna was a important person. She was the wife of a man named Chuza. I'm sure I'm not saying that correctly. But Chuza was Herod's business manager. Herod was the Roman who was in charge of Jerusalem, which means he would have been an important person. Also would have meant he was a Gentile, not a Jew. And if you notice, Joanna is not a name we see often in the Bible. So the first two people were mentioned in Luke chapter 8 in passing. Keep that in mind. It's going to become very relevant later. Two people in passing were the first two people mentioned being witness to the resurrection. Not two prominent characters. Two, oh, by the way, Jesus was healing people and Mary was there, and Joanna was there. And on with the story. That's it. Come back to that. The third person mentioned there is Mary, mother of James. I'm assuming, again, we're talking about James the disciple. I'm assuming that's who we're talking about here. Anybody have any idea why it's interesting that she is said to be Mary, the mother of James? Anything interesting about her being identified that way as being the mother of one of the disciples? There is a James, Jesus' brothers, and that proves the point that the name James is pretty common, which is why I can't say for sure if this is James, the disciples, one of the disciples. However, I'm pretty sure they would have called her Jesus' mother had it been that Mary. And that's one of the things I was going to tell you. When I looked it up, in the Gospels, there are no less than 6 different women named Mary. So there's a lot of them. Any other idea why it's strange she's mentioned as being the mother of, if this is James the disciple? That's right! She had 2 sons that were disciples. Who's the other guy? John? Not mentioned. Only mentioned one. So why is it James and John? You know, because Jesus even referred to them as the sons of thunder. I don't have an answer for that. I'm just putting it out there. For some reason, she's identified as James's mom and not John's. I have no idea why. I just find that to be a very interesting way to delineate who she is. So those are the 3 women who get names. There were several other women, but women, who writes their names down, right? Right? So he left all them out. You know, they just witnessed the single most important thing to happen since the creation of the world, but we're not sure who they are. Anyways. And again, we're going to come back to that idea. So, this group of women who went out to get into the tomb, not exactly sure how they're going to even get in there. When they get out there, the stone is not where it belonged. It was open to reveal something dramatic, which was there's nothing in the tomb. Body is gone. They're like, what's going on? These 2 guys who they realized were divine entities of some kind because they were wearing dazzling clothes showed up. They bowed down with their faces to the ground. The guy said, Jesus is alive. Don't look for live people in the cemetery. And then they basically left, I guess, after that. And then they said, well, we better go tell somebody. So they run back to tell the disciples. Verse 11. Okay, let's go back up to verse 10. Okay, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, several other women who told the apostles what had happened. Verse 11. But the story sounded like nonsense to the men, so they didn't believe it. Anybody care to comment? Yeah, it happens that way. All right, we got enough mileage out of that. I have no comment on verse 11. Verse 12. However, Peter jumped up, ran to the tomb to look. Stooping, he peered in and saw the empty linens wrappings. Then he went home, wondering what had happened. Is there something strangely missing when Peter was there? I made a big deal about it when the ladies were there. What was missing? How about the dazzling clothes dudes, whoever they were? Not there for Peter. All right. There's a lot of people who want to claim this is fake. Okay? Been a lot of people down through the years, even plenty of people today. It's a story, you know, it's a metaphor, it's a parable, whatever. I'm going to prove to you it's not. Right here tonight. Any of you who have your Bibles open, what's the story that comes immediately after this? Begins in verse 13. The road to Emmaus. The road to Emmaus is where Jesus then goes from this experience. He jumps out to the road to Emmaus, which is a suburb of Jerusalem, 7 miles out. And these two guys are walking, and Jesus shows up with them, has a conversation that lasts half a day into the evening, and these guys never recognize who he is until he's explaining the Old Testament, talking about all the stuff that happened and all these different things. They never realize who he is until he gets out to their house. Jesus acts like he's going to go on, and they're like, oh, no, please come stay with us tonight. So he says, well, fine, whatever. So he goes in, and he lifts the bread up, and he presses the bread, and he breaks it, and they're like, wait, is that Jesus? And he disappears. Apparently the bread falls on the table. So these two guys are like, holy cow. So they run back to Jerusalem, 7 miles. They find the disciples and begin to share the story. Here's how I can tell you this isn't fake. If this story had been faked, who would have had the dramatic experience? Because we have 3 different groups who have an experience. We have these ladies who we don't even know all their names. And then we have the Christian juggernaut, very influential guy in the early church named Cleopas. I have no idea who Cleopas even is. To a record, we did nothing else. And then in the middle of these 2 stories, we have a bunch of women that we don't even bother to write down their names, and Cleopas and his unnamed companion, so Luke only got one of those 2 guys. In the middle, you have Peter. And Peter runs out there, and nothing happens. All he saw was the disturbed grave, exactly as these crazy women explained to him, and that's it. This story was faked. Of those 3 groups, the women, Cleopas and what's his name, and Peter, which one of those 3 would have had the big experience? Peter. Because Peter has been the primary not Jesus character in this entire story. Yet he is barely mentioned in passing. If anybody was going to fabricate this thing, it would have been Peter. It would have been the disciples, yet none of them had the experience. It was a bunch of ladies who we don't even know the whole group, and it was Cleopas, a guy nobody's ever heard of. Those are the guys who saw Jesus first. And then after that, Jesus starts showing up to everybody. I give you this as evidence, I'll say. I can't say proof, even though it sounds like proof to me. As evidence it wasn't faked. Because if the ladies made this up, they would have got mentioned more than one time. If Cleopas would have made this up, somewhere we would have ran into the guy prior to this. Yet Peter, the guy who's all through the story, all he does is run out there and see, wow, it's exactly as they said, but no dazzling robed people talked to him, and he left. If this account was fake, the story would have been told very, very differently. The women and or Cleopas would have been the main characters the whole time, and we've never heard of any of them until now. Now, you could say, it's a coincidence, fine. I'm just telling you, this is not how fake stories work. This is not how hoaxes work. At least not any, and I've seen plenty of hoaxes in my time. I've never seen one that worked like this. Questions? Did I convince any of you? I don't know. I can't tell because you guys are like the ultimate poker face people here. Any questions about this? I offer the absurdity of this as proof it couldn't be made up, because lies. I mean, what's the saying? Truth is stranger than fiction. This is too off the wall. If they would have made it up, they'd have done a better job than this, in my opinion. But just my opinion. But there it is. All right. Any new insights on this? Did you learn anything? Learn anything new? Realize anything? Anybody want to go find out who Joanna is? There you go. You guys are not very talkative tonight. All right. Let's go on to Martin Luther. I had an absolute blast working this guy up. He was he was an interesting character. Said some interesting things, did some interesting things. The reputation of a stuffy old church person does not fit Martin Luther, not even by a long shot. He was a crazy guy. So Martin Luther was born on November the 10th, 1483, and he passed away on February the 18th, just anniversary of that just a few weeks ago, of 1546. He was ordained a Catholic priest in 1507 and was working in the priest, and he worked in that job for approximately 10 years till he started to develop a little bit of problem with what we would today call the Catholic Church. It would have been the only church at that time. But he started developing some problems with the Catholic Church. And the big problem he had, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, is the church was, we'll say the church's fundraising. He had a whole big bunch of problems with that. So he wrote his most famous, he wrote a number of books, but his most famous one is the 95 Theses, which we're going to look at in a second. He basically had 95 gripes against the Catholic Church. So what he did is he wrote this up and he says, guys, this is a problem, okay? This stuff that you're doing is not well. Let me articulate all my problems, and it took him 95 points to get them all across. And I've got them here, and I'm not going to share all of them with you. I'm going to share a few of them with you because some of them are very good points, and honestly, some of the rest of them are hilarious, the way he wrote them. But so we'll look at that in a second. He said this, he sent in 1520, he sent a copy of the 95 Theses, his problems. He sent it to the Pope. At that time it was Pope Leo X. The Pope never responded to his concerns, never wrote anything back to him. But what he did do is he took the publication he had of these 95 problems, and he gave them to his scribes and said, I want you to go over these with a fine-tooth comb, and I want you to point out every heresy you can find. And then once he got that, he submitted it on to Rome, which got Luther in trouble. Luther ended up being defrocked, and he was excommunicated from the Catholic Church in 1521. And they said that wasn't good enough, so they also declared him an outlaw. So now he's going to get arrested, and got him into trouble that way. And he caused all kinds of problems for the Catholic Church. Now I'm going to tell you right now, as a room full of Protestants, we're going to look at some of the things that he taught. You're not going to be shocked by any of them because you've heard them your entire life. But at this time, some of the stuff he was writing about would have been very shocking because it's not the way that they kind of conceived of things. His central teachings were salvation did not come from works. Again, I'm pretty sure you just heard a sermon on that literally last Sunday. But the idea is not from works. It comes from faith alone. Only faith can save you. There's nothing we can do that's ever going to make us good enough. That teaching came from Luther. But the problem with, and we all hear that and we're like, and? But the problem with that at that time is he was questioning the authority of the Pope. And that did not go over well, as you can imagine. And so once they kicked Luther out of the Catholic Church, and he was now free to write whatever he wanted, one of the things he said is, you know what? Any baptized believer is a priest. And again, as you can imagine, the Catholic Church, especially at that time, was like, no. And they did not like it at all. So as he got out and he started teaching things like faith and not works, and his expression was we do works, we do good things because we have faith. That began to change people. So people began to come into his movement. And it was interesting that as people were leaving the Catholic Church and coming into the church that Luther was starting, people referred to them as Lutherans, a term that he hated. Now, the reason he hated it is he says, I don't want my followers, I don't want anybody who's following this movement, who's going to be a part of this, I don't want them referred to as Lutherans. You know what I want to call them? I want to call them Christians. Now, who is he thumbing his nose at now? Remember, he says, they're doing their own thing. Our group has got Christians in it. And you can imagine that also was received poorly by people in charge. So he wanted his people to be called Christians. The other thing he wanted is he had an ardent devotion to Scripture. And one of the problems in the Catholic Church at that time is the Mass was all in Latin. And nobody understood it because those people all spoke German. So he did this amazing idea. He took the Bible, and since he had been classically trained and could speak both languages, he translated the Bible from Latin into German so people could read it. And he also used this kind of newfangled device that had come out called the printing press. And he started printing Bibles all over the place. And as far and wide as he could get them, because he wanted to put Scripture in people's hands. And he wanted to say to you, go read it. And I want you to go read it. He's saying that for 500 years now. Take the Scripture and go read it. Today where printing is much easier, and I even see some of you here tonight looking at the Bible on your phones and stuff. Luther would have been all about that because he wanted everybody to read it, to study it, to discuss it, to live it, to apply it. And he was very much into that. It says the printing press it was invented shortly before he was born, or about the time he was born. But it was invented, but as any new technology does, it takes a while to kind of be widespread. It was enough out there that he was able to do that. So as the Bible began to circulate and get out further and further in a language that people could read and understand, people were now starting to read this and realize that some of the things that the Pope was saying, well, that wasn't really how it was. And that began to create problems. Also, another thing that he was aggravated with is he was in a monastery for a while early in his career. And this monastery that he was in, I was going to write down the name of it, but I'm not sure I could even say it for you. But this monastery he was in had deplorable conditions. I don't know what else. They'd eat moldy food, and they give up all earthly things. And he was talking about how some nights he would go back to his chambers and he'd sleep on the floor because his bed had too much mold in it. I mean, it was really bad. And so he decided he didn't want to do that anymore either. So when they kicked him out, let's just say he wasn't real upset about that. So, and what happened was, as a priest earlier in his career, he was able to work with a nunnery that was there. And there was a convent there with nuns in it. And they were living in even more appalling conditions. And some of the women in that group says, when they found out he was getting kicked out, they said, can you get us out of here? Because there's no way to leave. And Luther said, yes, I will figure out a way. So what he did is he talked to some of the merchants who were bringing in food and arranged for barrels of fish that came in to feed the people. When they were empty, the women actually hid in the barrels and were smuggled out. He rescued them out of this convent to get them out. And it turns out that once he got them out, obviously they were like, well, we're not really interested in Catholicism anymore. They converted obviously to this new church, this church of Christians that was coming out. And one of them was a young lady named, where did I write her name down at? Catherine von Bora. Anybody know who Catherine von Bora was? She became Luther's wife. He got married, which he couldn't do as a Catholic priest, which is why clergy in this new movement that was happening were allowed to get married. And we happen to have an authority on that here tonight. There's Susan sitting right back there. You can ask her how that's going, and I hope she'll lie to you about that. So that's one of the things that were happening, and that was helping things out. So the biggest thing that aggravated Luther early in his career was the selling of a thing called indulgences. And what that basically, indulgences, and when we look at the 95 Theses, like 29 of the 95 are written about indulgences. He really hated these things. Because what would happen is if you sinned, you could actually buy grace from the church. I mean, I don't know how else to call it than that. So they would come along and they'd say, okay, do you want to, I mean, I guess it covered anything. You want to commit adultery, you want to work on the Sabbath, you want to, steal, you want to kill your neighbor, whatever. Here's what happened. You buy an indulgence, and the church will pray for you, and it will be forgiven. And Luther's like, I don't know that's how that works. But what they were doing was they were trying to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica, and they obviously needed funding for that. So they were selling indulgences. It was a fundraiser. I've tried to imagine how that would work today. You're like, we want to replace the projection system in the sanctuary, so if you want to sin for a mere $100, I will say it's okay. and I'm trying to figure out how awkward it's going to be when you come up and be like, Pastor Tim, I need 27, or something like that. I don't know how that works, but anyways, but that's how it was going on. So, and they were raising money that way, and Luther was like, this is wrong with a capital W. And he really hated that, and that's what really kind of set him in motion to say, what you guys are doing here is not following Christ. You're doing something else, and I'm not interested in that, which is what he finally got to. So they were doing all that and being a part of that. So he got out and did that. Now, not only was Luther he was the central character in what we know today as the Protestant Reformation, but he also was a prolific hymn writer. Wrote a lot of hymns. "Mighty Fortress Is Our God." Some of you may recognize that was written by Martin Luther, and a number of other hymns he wrote. I didn't recognize some of the titles. I imagine if we heard some of the tunes, we might recognize some of them. But wrote a lot of hymns and sang a lot of songs. What else? Again, he never intended to start a new church. He was trying to reform the old one. I mean, much like all Jesus was the same way. And but once the Catholic Church rejected him, then he's like, well, fine, then we'll just go on from there. So, all right, let me share with you. I have a list. I went through all these and I kind of highlighted them to different categories. And I've got 3 different categories. 29 of the 95 were about how evil indulgences were. We'll look at a few of them. 10 of them were about the importance of repentance, which was a big thing with Luther. It's not about paying to get your way out. It's about actually changing your life. It's not about changing your actions. It's about changing your heart, which, again, probably doesn't sound all that shocking to any of you because we are still talking about that today. And then he had 25 of them that were written specifically against the Pope. I'm not in any way surprised the Pope hated the guy, that just how much he talked about him. And there were 95 of these. I had a heck of a time trying to, because I didn't want to read all 95 of them because that would get tedious, but deciding which ones I was going to leave out was tough. If you want to look them up, just type in Luther's 95 Theses. You can go back and read them. Now, I got these in what I would call a modern translation, so I'm not reading these to you in the original script, so that way I don't have to translate them for you as we're going through them. But I want you to hear how awful some of these are. Awful, I mean, not he's awful, what he's responding to is awful. Some of these are. Because of these 95, he wasn't just like, I got to pad this list. No. He was responding to things that were clearly being done. And some of these are pretty terrible. The very first one is, when Jesus said repent, he meant that believers should live a whole life repenting. This isn't about saying, sorry, I screwed up, and then you're back on your way. That's not how it works. It's about a life transformation. Luther was really big into that. The fourth one is, sin will always remain until we enter heaven. I mean, we live in a sinful place. We're surrounded by it. It's everywhere. The number 5, and did I mention the Pope hated him? Number 5 is, the Pope must act according to canon law. Pretty big accusation. Now, to me, of all of them, number 10 is the worst. If this practice was actually happening, I find this to be deplorable. Now, remember how indulgences worked, okay? You sin, and then you basically buy some grace from the church. That's how indulgences worked. So number 10, the priest must not threaten those dying with the penalty of purgatory. Now, what I hear when he says that is if somebody was, sick or an old person or somebody who was dying, he's accusing, again, I don't know if this was actually happening, but I'm assuming it was. The priest would go in and say, wow, you're kind of on shaky ground here, but if you give us some money or leave us your estate, we'll see what we can do. If that was actually happening, friends, that is evil with a capital E. That's awful. And as if that wasn't bad enough, there's a couple, and then you go down to 13, it says, when you die, all your debts to the church will be wiped out, and those debts will be free from being judged. Basically saying we can't enforce things after you die. You know, if people are trying to extort money from you, once you're gone, there's really nothing more we can do. Number 14, the very next one. When someone is dying, they might have bad or incorrect thoughts against the church, and they will be scared. This fear is penalty enough. Meaning, don't hold stuff over dying people's heads. Do I even have to say this out loud? I mean, this is ridiculous, but that's what he's saying. I see some of you looking on your phones. If you're looking at these, if there's one you want to talk about, throw it out there. Let's see, number 27. It is nonsense to teach that a dead soul in purgatory can be saved by money. There it is. I don't know what else to say about it. What's that? The Catholic doctrine of purgatory, and again, it comes, and this is why the indulgence thing was such a big deal. Purgatory, according to the Catholic faith, is the place where you go after you die to kind of burn off your sin before you. It's kind of the vestibule to heaven, or kind of the waiting room to get into heaven. I don't know that I need to say this, but I will. Martin Luther did not buy into that at all. Okay, and we Protestants today reject that wholeheartedly. Grace either works or it doesn't. You don't need time. It doesn't need time to work. Yeah. Yep. And here's number 29. Now, some of these I can't believe he didn't write with a smirk. So number 29. Do we actually know if the souls in purgatory want to be saved? Wouldn't it be awkward? It's like you buy indulgences for somebody and they're like, heaven, like, I don't want to be here. I mean, that would be weird, right? So, no. They finally decided that was probably not the way to go. They do bingo now for fundraising. So, and cakes, and raffle wheels and stuff, yeah. Verse number 36, a man can be free of sin if he sincerely repents, and indulgence is not needed. It doesn't do anything. I mean, he made that very clear. Number 42, Christians should be taught that the buying of indulgences does not compare with being forgiven by Christ. How much does that indulgence mean to somebody? It means exactly the amount I paid for it, not 1 cent more. However, if we're talking about Jesus turning your life around, it's kind of a powerful idea. A Christian who gives to the poor or lends to those in need is doing better in God's eyes than one who buys indulgences. Think about that one. So, I'm not going to give to mission projects. I'm not going to give to feed the poor, but I'll buy this thing so I can, do this bad thing. He's making what seems to be a very obvious suggestion that God is much more pleased when we invest our money in good things rather than buying things so we can do more bad stuff. I mean, it seems obvious, but let's see. Okay, here's one. Remember what I told you? They were selling indulgences as a fundraiser to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica? Number 50. If the Pope knew how much people were being charged for indulgences, he would prefer to demolish St. Peter's himself. Now, remember, today, if you go out and buy something today, what happens? There's a transaction that takes place. You give money or you give credit card or whatever, and what do you get back? A receipt, and there's a paper trail in there, and all that money's accounted for. Back in these days, it was the priest walking around with a deep pocket. They had no idea. And the priest would be like, today, indulgences are $200. What can I say? Inflation is tough, right? And he may only give $100 back to the fundraiser, and there was no way to account for that. And since there was no way to be accountable for that, you can almost guarantee it was happening. Don't compare today to what I'm reading to you. This is the Catholic Church in the 1500s. They have greatly fixed their practices. But go ahead.
So if the priest says, do the rosary 20 times, and is that kind of
I would say no, because the purpose of doing that is to help the person realign their soul. It's a spiritual practice. Now, if the priest said, that sin will be $75, yeah, that would be a problem. They're not saying that, but I'm just saying it's a different thing. Spiritual practices and prayers and stuff, Luther, I think, would actually approve of that. So, let's see here. Number 56. The treasure of the church is not sufficiently known among the followers of Christ. What does that mean? Let me read it to you again. Not only do we not know where it is, we don't know what it is. They're saying that all these poor people who are kicking in all this money don't realize how much money you actually got. Yeah. Let's see. Number 62. The main treasure of the church should be the Gospels and the grace of God, not money. Which again, seems obvious when you say it this way. Okay, now we get down toward the end where I'm pretty sure that Luther was just like, I got the knife stuck in, I'm going to twist it. So some of these at the end actually made me laugh. Number 82. Why doesn't the Pope go out and wash people's feet and collect money that way? That's an interesting question. Any indulgence bought for someone who has died should be repaid by the Pope himself. You can imagine that one didn't go over too well. Evil men must not buy their salvation when a poor man who is a friend of God cannot. Number 86. The Pope should rebuild St. Peter's with his own money. You can imagine that one wasn't greatly appreciated either. Number 88. What good would be done to the church if the Pope was to forgive hundreds of people each day? Let me read that again. How much good is the church doing if the Pope has to sell hundreds and hundreds of indulgences each day? Who's actually being changed by that? We're collecting lots of money, but I don't see any hearts being changed in that. Number 91. If the Pope had worked as he should, all the problems stated above would never have existed. Did I mention the Pope hated him? Did I mention that? 92. Anyone who says there's no problem here must go. These problems need to be addressed. 93. The church and all who claim there, even in the church, those who claim there's no problem must also go. Number 94. I'm reading this one just because it should be painfully obvious. Christians must follow Christ at all cost. Seems straightforward. And finally, the grand finale, number 95. Let Christians experience problems if they must and overcome them rather than live a false life based on present Catholic teaching. Did I mention the Pope hated him? All right. So he was swinging for the fence on this thing. Now, here's the interesting thing. The only way that Luther's Protestant Reformation happens, he can't do it himself. Somebody's got to agree with this. And a lot of people did. A lot of people started asking some questions about what exactly is going on here. And how do we know an indulgence is going to work at all? Where do you get the authority to even sell one of these things? I mean, St. Peter's Basilica is amazing. I'll definitely give you that. But it just seems to me like we're missing the point. And that's when Luther's churches, the churches filled with Christians, started to grow like crazy. And a lot of people were coming out, not only people who were leaving the Catholic Church or were smuggled out of the Catholic Church, but also a lot of people who may have been estranged from the church for a long time. People who couldn't afford all these indulgences, who the Catholic Church decided we don't really have time for them because they don't have any money anyways. And a lot of people started to come up. And it's this idea that led to the Protestant Reformation. So what I want you to see is that the church that we have here at Wayne Street, I mean, we are a part of this, the reason it exists at all is because we exist as a corrective to what was going on in the church at that time. Now, I'm not saying a word about what the Catholic Church is today. They've changed a lot, and their sisters and brothers and everything else. But because things were so corrupt in the 1500s, that corruption, that bad practice, that sin, that disgrace translated into something very good because people stood up and said, no, we're not doing this anymore. No more indulgences, no more money. We're going to go worship God, and we're going to go back to these scriptures that we can now read for the first time and move on from there. Now, I'm not saying the Protestant church doesn't have its problems. We here at Wayne Street understand that very well as we just jump from one denomination to another. But in the midst of that, we exist as a response to something evil that was going on. Because I'm sure there are more evil things a person can do, but to go up to a dying person and say, you better buy some indulgences just in case, I can't think of a more evil thing to say than that. Even if I thought that, I don't know that I could bring myself to say it, which I don't think that. But sometimes societies and organizations and groups of people has to start over by hitting the bottom. And that's exactly what happened here. So, yeah.
Once someone passed away, could the family buy indulgences?
Absolutely. According to the old system, they could, yes.
Get them out of purgatory, right? Everybody goes to purgatory, or only those who are marginally sinful?
Everybody goes to purgatory. Now, how much time you're actually there, whether it's a couple of days or a couple of centuries, just depends on, I'm not sure what factors. Yeah. So, if you had deep, yeah, yeah, and I'm not sure there's a prescription to say, but according to the way it works, you're there till all your sin is burned off, however long that takes.
No reference in the Bible.
No, purgatory does not. The closest thing that happens to that is the story, not the Lazarus story that we know, but Luke's story of Lazarus, where Lazarus was a poor man and he died and went to heaven, and the rich man went to hell. And the rich man says, will you go tell my brothers to avoid this place? That's as close to purgatory as we get, and it's not that close. So, but there's no concept of purgatory in the Bible as understood that way. Well, all right, I'm going to cop out on this one and say, well, I'm not Catholic trained, so I don't know. But my guess is where it came from is they needed a way to explain, to encourage people to live. Originally, back prior to the time period we're talking about, my guess is they needed a way to motivate people to still be good, to still do Christian practice, and rewards and punishments are the only thing that motivates people. Nothing else does. So when you start saying free gift of grace, and people are like, yeehaw, I'm done, even though it's not correct. And so purgatory, I think, was where that concept came from. Yeah.
You said at the very beginning he was classified as an outlaw.
Yes.
How was he able to do everything he did as an outlaw?
Because the authorities that be didn't care. They declared him an outlaw, and you call the cops on anybody, but the cops are like, we don't care. Then that's it. So, yep. And the nice thing is for Luther is once his movement started to take up, nobody wanted to challenge him. I mean, there's a blessing to being successful. So, but I just think it's funny. It would be like, like the United Methodist Church calling the police on me, saying, "Hey, he's doing all this stuff," and they would come over to my house and be like, "Yeah," and so. Any other questions? You guys enjoy Luther? Luther is great. There's a lot of his writings later in his life where he got colorful in how much he hated Satan. And I couldn't read any of those two here tonight because some of the language that he used. But some of it's pretty fascinating. So if you're ever looking for something interesting to read, you can go check out some of that. Some of it, honestly, is downright hilarious. I mean, Luther must have been quite a guy. So we don't normally think of church leaders as being, humorous because we always portray them as pious. And he was, but I don't know it's in the way we think. So, All right, you want to do a couple of GMC things here? Even though I just put you through 95 theses, we'll do 7 more. And actually, if you took the 77 theses of the United Methodist or the GMC and put them up against 95 theses from Luther, you're not going to find a whole lot of difference. Obviously, we're not worried about the selling of indulgences because nobody's doing that anymore, so a lot of those we left. But the concepts, very, very similar. Changed very little in the last 500 years. All right. Speaking of how money doesn't change a soul, here's GMC number 50. How does grace dawn in the helpless soul? God's preventing or prevenient grace, for those of you who've been on an Emmaus walk, prevenient grace lightens the effects of original sin even before we are aware of our need for God. What prevenient grace recognizes in the life of a believer is God's work in our life before we become aware of it. Because we believe, and as I think pretty much all Christian denominations do, we believe that God is working on you whether you want to recognize it or not. Now, you can live in denial of it if you want. I certainly would not recommend that, but you can if you want. But we believe God is always working even before we're aware of it. And that's how grace begins we become aware of it, by recognizing what God is doing for us. Number 51, how does preventing grace lighten the effects of original sin? It prevents full consequences of our alienation from God and awakens conscience, giving an initial sense of God and the first inclinations toward life. You all have probably heard before at some point that the really awful part of hell is not the fire and brimstone. I'm not saying that that's pleasant, but the actual worst part of hell is the absence of God. We have never lived with that. For our entire time on this planet, we have never been without God. We may have lived in denial of Him, but we've never been without Him. We have no idea what that's like. These clowns who get on TV and say, I'm an atheist and I'm awesome and stuff, they don't know. They don't know what they know not what they say, because we have never lived without God. We may have lived in denial of God. We may have lived in open rebellion against God, but we've never lived without God. And none of us know what that is, and I personally am never going to find out. Wouldn't recommend it to you either. Number 52. How does preventing grace reestablish the freedom of the will? While in our bound and helpless state, preventing grace breaks through and enables genuine response to God's further grace. Again, I guess I got a little ahead of myself. The idea that we've never lived without God, we don't know what that's like. That grace, that presence is still working within us, protecting us, guiding us, comforting us, until the moment we decide, there probably is something here, and then things change. It's God's continued work in our life that helps kind of move us in that direction. Now, number 53. This is one I found to be a little interesting. Does God determine all human action? No. Why not? Yeah, no free will. We're robots. If God had just basically set everything in motion and just kind of walked away from it, we're robots, and we are not that. Okay? No, influenced and empowered by the Holy Spirit, humans are responsible in freedom to exercise their wills for good. Now, a lot of parts of our life would be a lot easier if God just kind of set everything out there and did it. And we could debate what would be better, what would be worse, but I'm just telling you how it is. And how it is you have a lot of autonomy. You have a lot of freedom to make these decisions. And you have the freedom to absolutely burn your life down if you want. Again, wouldn't recommend that, but it's yours to do with what you want. Number 54. What is salvation? By salvation, we mean more than the promise of eternal life. Can I read that again? Because I want you all to hear that. If you don't get nothing else out of tonight, get this sentence. By salvation, we mean more than the promise of eternal life. A lot of times we look at our Christian faith and our walk with Christ as the kind of pie in the sky when you die kind of thing. That's not it. Christianity has just as much of a right now component as it has in that time component. Yeah, that's going to be pretty great. I'm not denying that. But to say that that's all there is to it, is we're just in this for the payday at the end, you're back to indulgences. And that's where you are. And because there's no joy in it now. By salvation, we mean more than the promise of eternal life, but a present deliverance from sin, a restoration of the soul to its original purity, a recovery of divine nature in righteous and true holiness, and in justice, mercy, and truth. I mean, that word salad basically says we have been empowered and enabled to do good things in this world, and by George, we ought to do them. Number 55, two more. Number 55. How does God lead us to repentance? God's convincing grace awakens us to a desire to flee the wrath to come and enables us to begin to fear God and work righteousness today. This is again not about. We're not in God's waiting room until we get called home. We are now in a part of a journey that's taking us through this life, and how this life goes is going to be determined by the choices you make. So I would highly recommend you make good ones. And finally, number 56. How does God reconcile us to himself? God's justifying grace works by faith to bring reconciliation to God through the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Okay, before we recognize it, it's called prevenient grace. Don't ask me to spell that because there's a lot of E's in it, but prevenient grace. And then the moment we recognize it, we call it justifying grace. That's the moment it transitions, and I'm assuming when we go further, we'll talk about sanctifying grace is what goes on from that point. But that's the moment of justification. We're going to read about Paul experiencing that on the road to Damascus. Most of you probably have a story when we would call it maybe a conversion story, even though that's not really what that is. That's the way it's referred to a lot. But it's the moment you became aware of God's grace in a very specific way. And I've got a story that I've told probably too many times, but the idea is there's a moment we can recognize that's called justifying grace, and it's the moment that everything changes. It's one of those milestones in life where your life is everything that came before that moment and everything that came after. That's what we call milestones. And most of us have, a number of those, but your recognition of the grace of God is one of them, I hope. All right, questions about any of that? We covered an incredible amount of ground tonight. I feel like when you guys leave, you're like exhausted. So.
I did want to, my question on why were they going at the two?
Yeah.
If you read the crucifixion story, the last verse of that, it says they went to prepare the spices, and it got too late, and it was the Sabbath.
Yes.
They couldn't go back.
Correct.
And so we know from other books that it was sealed and
Right.
supposedly.
Yeah, in some versions there's guards posted and all kind of stuff. Yeah.
And they said it's very likely that they never even knew that happened. They went home for the Sabbath.
Oh yeah, it is very likely because especially women wouldn't have been even allowed to be there. Yeah.
So yeah, they were just
Yeah.
trying to finish their job.
Correct.
The next-
Correct. Do their due diligence, exactly. And they wanted to do that, which is what makes it so fascinating that they still didn't. They still didn't happen. So, very good. You guys enjoying this? Okay. We are this current rotation that we're on is scheduled to end the Wednesday before Easter. Will be our last time in this session. Would you be interested if I were to put together another series of this to go from the Wednesday after Easter on through like right before Memorial Day? It'd be like 8 more weeks. Would you? I don't want to put it together if you guys are like, nah, we did our time, we're out. But if you guys will come back, express that to me. If enough of you will come back, I will set up something that will go another 8 weeks to get us through Memorial Day. So let me know that, communicate that with me somehow, and we'll work on it from there. But we still have a few more weeks here. So thank you all for coming. It would be very awkward if I was in here teaching this without you because I'd be talking to myself. So. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.